The soft hum of traffic outside barely masked the distant sound of a barking dog. Inside a small, well-lit veterinary clinic, the receptionist tapped her fingers on the desk, glancing at the clock. It was almost closing time. The day had been long, filled with worried pet owners, wagging tails, and the occasional scratch from a feisty cat. Just as she was about to let out a relieved sigh, the door swung open. A man stepped in, carrying a trembling dog wrapped in a blanket. His face was hidden beneath a baseball cap, his movements careful, almost hesitant. The receptionist straightened up, ready to greet him, but before she could speak, the man pulled down his hood slightly, and for a moment she froze. The face was unmistakable, Keanu Reeves. She blinked, processing the sight before her. It wasn't every day a Hollywood star walked into their tiny clinic, especially not looking like this, worried, exhausted, and cradling what looked like an injured dog. The animal whimpered softly, its small body pressed against Keanu's chest. "I need help," Keanu said, his voice quiet but urgent. Before the receptionist could respond, the clinic's head veterinarian, Dr. Langley, appeared from the back. He was in his late 50s, with graying hair and a no-nonsense attitude. He glanced at the clock, then at the man before him. His eyes flickered with recognition, but instead of excitement, his expression hardened. "I'm sorry," Dr. Langley said, folding his arms. "We're closing soon. You'll have to take your dog somewhere else." Keanu's brow furrowed. "Please," he said. "She's in pain. I just need someone to look at her." The vet shook his head. "I don't do last-minute emergencies. And besides," he added, his eyes narrowing, "we don't just treat any dog that walks in off the street. We have policies. No appointment, no service." The receptionist swallowed, sensing the tension in the air. She wanted to say something, to tell the doctor that they could at least take a quick look, but Dr. Langley had already turned away. Keanu stood there for a moment, his lips pressed into a thin line, his grip tightening around the trembling dog. "Are you serious?" Keanu asked, his voice carrying a quiet intensity. Dr. Langley didn't even look back. "Like I said, take it somewhere else." For a few seconds, there was silence. Then, without another word, Keanu turned on his heel and walked out into the night. The door shut behind him with a soft thud, leaving the clinic eerily quiet. The receptionist watched him go, her stomach twisting with unease. Something about the whole encounter felt wrong. But what Dr. Langley didn't know, what no one in that room realized, was that this wasn't just any dog, and turning Keanu Reeves away. That was a mistake he would regret sooner than he ever imagined. Because the truth was about to come out, and when it did, nothing would ever be the same again. As Keanu stepped out into the cold night, he adjusted the blanket around his dog, feeling the rise and fall of her shallow breaths, his jaw clenched. He wasn't angry. Keanu rarely let himself get that way, but he was frustrated, disappointed. He had come here because it was the closest clinic, because he thought that surely, if they saw the pain in his dog's eyes, they would help. But he had been wrong. The city streets were quieter now, the neon lights from the nearby shops flickering in the darkness. He looked down at his dog, brushing a gentle hand over her fur. "We'll find someone else," he murmured. She whimpered softly in response. He had to hurry. Meanwhile, inside the clinic, the receptionist, Emma, was still staring at the door. A knot of unease tightened in her chest. She didn't know much about celebrities. Sure, she had seen some of Keanu's movies, but that didn't matter. What mattered was that a man had come in desperate for help, and they had turned him away. More importantly, an innocent dog was suffering. She hesitated before glancing toward the back room, where Dr. Langley was tidying up for the night. For years, he had been a respected vet in this part of town, but lately, something had changed. He had become colder, less willing to bend the rules, more concerned with policies and schedules than the animals themselves. Emma bit her lip, debating whether to say something. But before she could decide, the phone rang. She picked it up, trying to push away her thoughts. Across town, Keanu was dialing another clinic from his phone. No answer. Then another. Closed. He exhaled sharply, glancing down at his dog, who was still curled up in his arms. Her breathing was getting weaker. He couldn't wait any longer. Just as he was about to get into his car, a voice called out, "Mr. Reeves." He turned to see a young woman, probably in her late 20s, hurrying toward him. It took him a second to recognize her. It was the receptionist from the clinic. She hesitated, catching her breath. "I'm sorry about what happened back there. I couldn't let it go." Keanu studied her for a moment. There was genuine concern in her eyes. "I know a vet," she continued, "not far from here. She's not a big-name doctor or anything, but she actually cares. If you want, I can call her." Keanu didn't hesitate. "Please." Emma quickly pulled out her phone, her fingers moving fast. She knew Dr. Miller would answer, she always did. And sure enough, after just 2 rings, the familiar voice came through. "Dr. Miller, it's Emma. I have an emergency. A dog needs help. Now." There was no hesitation on the other end. "Bring them to me." Relief washed over Emma as she nodded at Keanu. "Let's go." As they rushed off into the night, neither of them knew that what had just happened at the clinic was about to become a much bigger story than they could ever imagine. Because the truth about the dog, the real reason she needed help, was something that would shake everyone, especially Dr. Langley, to their core. And by the time the world found out, it would be too late for regrets. Emma's car weaved through the quiet streets, her hands gripping the wheel tightly. Keanu sat beside her, his dog still wrapped in the blanket, his focus entirely on her fragile breathing. Every few seconds, he whispered something to her, words of comfort, reassurance, as if willing her to hold on just a little longer. Dr. Miller's small home clinic was tucked away in a quiet neighborhood, the porch light casting a soft glow on the driveway. Before Emma could even knock, the door swung open. A woman in her late 40s, dressed in scrubs, her hair tied back in a messy bun, stood waiting. "Bring her in," she said immediately. Keanu stepped inside, carefully placing his dog on the examination table. Dr. Miller worked fast, her hands moving with practiced precision as she checked the dog's vitals. The room was silent except for the soft beeping of a heart monitor and the occasional whimper from the tiny creature. After a few moments, Dr. Miller let out a slow breath and met Keanu's gaze. "She's dehydrated, weak, and in pain," she said, her voice gentle but firm. "But I need to ask, where did you find her?" Keanu hesitated. "She's mine," he said simply. "I've had her for a while." Dr. Miller frowned slightly, lifting the dog's front paw carefully. "She has an identification chip," she murmured, scanning it with a small device. When the screen lit up, her eyes widened. She looked at Keanu, confusion and something else, something close to shock, flickering across her face. "This dog," she said slowly, "was reported stolen." The words hung in the air for a moment. Emma's heart skipped a beat. Keanu's expression didn't change, but there was a shift in the room, an unspoken understanding that something much bigger was happening. "She wasn't stolen," Keanu said after a moment. "She was rescued." Dr. Miller looked at him, waiting. Keanu exhaled. "A few weeks ago, I was at an adoption event. There was this breeder there, someone who was trying to pass off sick dogs as healthy ones. I could tell something was wrong. When I looked closer, I saw her, too weak to even stand. I couldn't leave her there. I took her." Emma felt her chest tighten. She had heard about illegal breeding operations before, places where dogs were kept in cages, forced to have litter after litter, never knowing kindness. The thought of this little dog suffering like that made her stomach turn. Dr. Miller nodded slowly. "I believe you," she said, "and you did the right thing." Keanu looked down at his dog, his fingers brushing lightly over her head. "She's been getting better," he murmured. "But tonight, she just collapsed." Dr. Miller sighed. "She's been through a lot, but she's a fighter. And now she has people who care." Emma felt a lump in her throat. She had almost let this dog walk out of the clinic without help. She had almost listened to Dr. Langley. Speaking of him, she pulled out her phone. A quick search confirmed what she already suspected. Dr. Langley had once been investigated for unethical practices, specifically for turning away pets in need if he deemed them not worth the effort. There were stories from pet owners, all saying the same thing. She glanced at Keanu. "He's done this before," she said quietly. "Dr. Langley, I think he only helps when it's convenient for him." Keanu nodded, as if he wasn't surprised. Then people should know. And they did. The story spread. It wasn't about Keanu Reeves being turned away from a vet clinic. It was about what that moment represented, about how many people had faced the same situation, but without the platform to speak out, about how a single act of indifference could mean the difference between life and death for an innocent animal. Dr. Langley's clinic faced scrutiny. People started sharing their own experiences, and soon the truth was out. He had spent years valuing efficiency over compassion, and now his reputation was crumbling. As for Keanu's dog, she made it. With the right care, she recovered, stronger than ever. And she never had to worry again, because she had found her home, not just with a Hollywood star, but with someone who truly loved her. One small act of kindness had changed everything, and in the end, that's what mattered most.